today's event. It's so wonderful to see you with us for our event today, Clearing the Path to Data-Driven Decisions. I'm Dr. Craig Ogeron, a senior fellow at the Center for Digital Government, and also lucky to be a professor of MIS at Millsaps College. I am thrilled to be here and serve as moderator for today's event. It's a fabulous topic, and I just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. I know we're in for a wonderful and informative session over the next 30 minutes. Before we begin, just a couple of brief housekeeping notes that are up on the screen for you. Recording of this presentation will be emailed to all of you within about 48 hours. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass it along to friends or colleagues. The webcast is designed to be interactive. And you can participate in a Q&A with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom left of your presentation panel. And as we wrap and close the webinar out, we very much encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd love to hear what you think. If you're unable to stay with us for the entire webinar, we certainly understand. But we'd like you to complete the survey as much as you're able to do so. Just please click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch it. Otherwise, it will pop up once the webinar concludes. Okay, so with some of our housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to make introductions. Joining me today to discuss this very, very timely topic is Shahir Khan, who leads the Health and Human Services practice at Resultant, a public sector focused technology consulting firm. Shahir is eminently qualified. He and his team help national, state, and city health and human services leaders unlock insights from their existing data and use those insights to drive better outcomes for citizens. Really and truly what good government is all about. He comes to Resultant after more than a decade in the city of New York, including his last role in the mayor's office as the senior advisor for health and human services during the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic. Before that, he served in New York City's public hospital system, ran the city's healthcare economic development team, and helped the state of Rhode Island implement healthcare reform. He brings a vast diversity of government experience, from classic zoning and services delivery supporting large-scale programmatic initiatives. So with that, let me take just a second and set the stage for you for our conversation about data-driven decisions. As we prepared for this discussion, one key theme that Shahir and I both noted was how state and local governments have a wealth of data, a true goldmine of data, but many agencies just aren't taking or making the best use of it, even organizations that are using modern data management and analytical tools. Especially with the influx of federal funding through COVID relief, the American Recovery Act, and other sources, agencies are starting to think about how to use this potentially once-in-a-lifetime influx to modernize their systems and to address the future crisis that may be around the corner from a resiliency perspective. We're looking forward to discussing the fundamentals of good data modernization and how your agency can build or enhance its data strategy. Okay, I think we are ready. Why don't we jump in with a poll question? So our first poll question, the first step towards developing a data modernization strategy and approach is assessing your organization's readiness. How confident are you in your organization's current capabilities to initiate a data modern initiative? Okay, so highly confident, capable, and ready to embark on a data modernization effort, confident, ready with several lingering challenges, somewhat confident, ongoing planning efforts are actively underway, or not confident, that there are just key components that it's lacking in readiness. Could be funding, could be skills, or you're just not sure. So take just a minute to look at those. Okay, let's take a look at our results and see where we are. Wow, interesting. Somewhat confident. Okay. I'm always, Shahir, I'm not sure about you. I'm always just so interested in looking at this. Um, so we've got 56.3% that are somewhat and 31 not confident at all. Wow, fascinating. So with that, with sort of that baseline for us to have a wonderful conversation about, let's just start out to take a minute and really think and ingest these results. Tell me what you think when you see these percentages up there, Shahir.
That's a great question. And thanks, Craig, for the kind introduction and for making the time, and to the folks who have made time to actually join the webinar. So I will sort of take a different tack at this. And I wonder what folks were thinking about when they made those choices. So when you think about data modernization, you're assessing whether your organization is ready. I wonder what that means for you, because I think that could have a huge impact on how you actually vote and what your perception is. So the place where I would start is by asking that first. And I'm going to be honest, this is like a vulnerable question because lots of people have different perspectives on what this is. So for us, and for me in particular, I think of data modernization not as a technology question as much as it is an organizational question. Data modernization to me means having the various data that you already own, probably living within your legacy systems. Perhaps it's in some other format, being made available for people in a way that doesn't break what you already have in place. So that's what I mean by resilient and accessible for the future. And if that's your framework, I think it's much easier to assess whether you're there or not. And that fits, I think, the framing you just shared, Craig, that there are organizations that may have fully fledged data and analytics teams, but they may not be data modern because there could be data sets that aren't connected. There could be data sets that are not available for users. So for us, I think a data modernized world is one in which you're probably in the cloud. You've got all of the data that's in your legacy systems being pulled out of there into electronic data warehouse or data lakehouse, something like that, where your analysts can access it without breaking what's going on. The fact that I think the majority of our respondents are fairly confident is a great sign. I think that's an indication that people are starting to take data seriously. And for the reasons I think you highlighted, the pandemic proved to us why understanding your data sets and using your data sets is critical to government responding in a thoughtful and timely manner.
Yeah, I'm really with you on that, right? I'm super encouraged by the somewhat confident vote that they're really looking at this, because what I can sort of pull out of that is that they're really beginning to see and feel the value that that data can bring, right? Because that's really, I think you have to have contextually, I think you have to have a belief that you can do things with this data. You can make decisions. You can move the ball forward. So fabulous. So with that, when you think about the development from a strategy perspective of a data modernization effort, what does that first step look like to you? And let's say maybe, what's the first step? And then also, how do you really know if you've got the right strategy to move forward, right? Because I think there would be some angst in, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? What's in your head on that?
That's a great question. I would start with something, I'd start with two different things. One is really simple. Just does your data modernization strategy address, I think, the elephant in the room for a lot of public sector folks? We know that people in the public sector are struggling. The pandemic was a great example. In my home city of New York, we have something like 20% vacancy rate for civil service jobs. So I would start by thinking about your workforce. Data modernization is really exciting because it allows you to bring the latest in technology to your staff, to excite people, to show them how we can use data to solve problems for the people that we want to help. People are not working in government because they're looking for those annual raises or the bonus checks. Like, this is not Wall Street. They're still there if they're still there because they care about the outcomes. And that's what I remember the most of from working through the pandemic. And I would start there. When you think about a data modernization strategy, think about how it impacts your workforce, how your workforce is ready to use that data, or how you train your workforce to start using that data, because your workforce is what will implement anything that you want to do. Moving forward from that, I would, again, I'm stating simple things, but what is the biggest challenge in your city, your town, your municipality, your state? You probably have a sense of what that problem is, and think through how you can solve that problem. For us, obviously, we had COVID. We had fairly significant challenges with the opioid epidemic, with homelessness, with mental health. And our strategy was always to think about what data we could use to answer those problems. And as you start thinking about that, what I think we came to realize is that the key to really understanding complicated problems was bringing lots of different data sets together, right? You're not going to understand the complexity of someone who is struggling with street homelessness by just looking at whether they've applied for a housing voucher. That's not the whole picture. It probably has something to do with engagement with the justice system. It may have something to do with financial insecurity. It may have something to do with behavioral health, access to somatic health. All of those pieces can be brought together. And when you do that, you have a robust picture of a person, because that's ultimately who we're trying to help. And that leads you to what I think is a really thoughtful data modernization strategy, which is one that pulls together multiple different data sets and allows us to unlock those insights. If you're doing that for homelessness, if you're doing that for behavioral health, if you're doing that for COVID, you've built the infrastructure that allows you to answer all of the other questions. And I think that's really our point, Craig, when we were going back and forth. It's that don't build a widget, because you could just as easily come up with a strategy that focuses on this one problem, and you can build a system to solve that one problem. But if you could just take it a step further and you're building a system that is resilient and usable to answer lots of different problems using those same data sets, that I think is an ideal outcome, because it keeps the workforce engaged, because they can ask questions, they can do self-service data analysis, and it prepares you for the next crisis that's coming around the corner. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fabulous. So a couple of double clicks, if you don't mind, of what you said.
Yeah, please.
So the first part that you mentioned on the workforce side, I mean, I think what really resonates for me there is, the skill sets, right? I mean, I think we were challenged in particular. So there may not be one right way to do it. We developed a fabulous partnership with some scholars in our universities, right, who were more adept naturally with dealing with data. And that turned out to be highly fruitful to the point that one of the universities actually developed a data science program out of it. Like, so this faculty member that I befriended, who helped us in sort of our initiatives that we had, eventually also went on to found a data science program. So you start seeing that pebble in the pond concept, right? This rippling out. The other part that you mentioned, I thought, was just so spot on. My own experience was really with attempting to better education outcomes, right? And it was something that we had a lot of success with doing the third part of your list, which was bringing these data sets together, making these connections that heretofore had not been connected, right? And we did. We came up with this third grade reading gate sort of model, which sort of suggested for the first time that if you don't have these skills as a third grader, it's going to put you at a disadvantage, right? So I think that three-step plan, I think, is spot on, right? So the workforce, think about the problem, and then making these connections with data is phenomenal.
I think what I reflected on
yeah,
I think your story also highlights a really important point. And I think this is getting more towards the bits and bytes. And I see Kara's question, which we'll address, I think, a little bit later on. You need to start with a problem, which then allows you to frame the strategy, which then allows you to have the conversation with your elected officials, with your agency leaders, and with others to be able to move that ball forward. I think that's a point that you just stressed, because education was a priority for you. For us, COVID, some of these other issues were priorities that allowed us to have the types of conversations around governance, operational issues that are going to be really important, but will also be very specific, I think, to a locality or geography.
Yeah, agree totally. And I think this is a good time, for Kara's question in terms of governance. I'm a big believer that governance is very, very important. I will tell you, in my sliver of the world, we approached it initially with legislation that just sort of gave a framework for the sharing, right, is really how I would frame it. After that, to Kara's question, right, there were policies, bylaws, procedures underneath this framework. So exactly what you think, right? Legislation, and then sort of from an administrative perspective, uh, you know, policies and frameworks more operationally. Um, I will say, Shahir, I'm a big believer in this. I know many times we can um, chase the technology part of it, but I think you've really got to be thoughtful. And Kara really hit it on the spot in terms of governance. I'm a big believer in it. What's in your head on that?
I think you have taken the words right out of my mouth. So I'd add a couple of things there, and I think the way Kara framed it is exactly the way I would think about it. So the technology, I would argue, is table stakes for these kinds of conversations. Like, the technology will be there. We will implement the right technology. We need the strategy first, and I think what follows from strategy is the governance. If the problem we're trying to solve is A, B, C, or D, you need the right agencies at the table. You need to make sure those incentives are aligned. You set the governance framework around that. You think deeply about the data. You think about what sharing is appropriate. I think that's a really key point, which I think we were going to hit on later. But I think you and I are both advocates of data sharing, making data available to everyone so you can drive insights out of it. But data is also dangerous, and we have vulnerable populations in our communities, and we have to be really thoughtful about that. So the governance is the hard part. The governance is where the strategy meets the road. And I think you and I were joking about this, that doing those projects are the best and worst experiences, because when you get that breakthrough, you've got 15 lawyers in the room and you're able to figure that out. It's incredibly powerful, but it's tough work. But what I would say is the key to making those conversations work is having that strategic picture. Because when you have a strategic picture and you know where you're going, it's much easier for the GCs of the three agencies to come together and say, okay, I recognize that this is governed by 42 CFR, this is governed by HIPAA, this is governed by something else. Let's find a way to make it work, because it's going to make a difference for these people, as opposed to finding a reason not to do it. And that, again, is why that framing is so important. If you know where you're going, you're much more likely to get those pieces aligned. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, and I will have to say what you said is spot on. I mean, I think my experience was sort of, and we were joking, best of times, worst of times. I mean, it was so incredible to get these sort of projects going, but they were very, very difficult. So listen, let me pivot real quick. You said a couple of words, of course, that I love, right? You said cloud, and you talked about legacy systems as well. There are a lot of governments that still have a whole lot of data in these systems. So let's just chat about kind of being able to free this data, if you will, from these monolithic systems to leverage and power sharper decisions. And where are you at on that?
Yeah, that is a very interesting and loaded question. And I think it speaks to the computational power that's out there, right? I mean, everybody has now discovered ChatGPT. If folks haven't, they should discover it and play with it. But it's an illustration of the computational power that's out there. But if your data is locked in production systems, it makes it really hard to play with. So I think the simple answer is think about how you unlock that data without breaking your production systems. You may have a mainframe in place. For public health, there may be old-fashioned registries, communicable disease registries, et cetera, that you don't want to break because your epidemiologists are used to working with them. Like, that's the world that I come from. That's a world that I know really well. But what you can do is replicate that data, potentially de-identify it if that's important for you, and put it into some kind of self-service environment. I think philosophically, that's what I would recommend. When you put it into a self-service environment and you've got the appropriate protections in place, you're no longer messing with your system. You're not making your legacy users upset, because they're probably doing something. Think about a Medicaid enterprise system, for instance, or a system that's running a DMV. You don't want to break that. You don't want to play with that. By moving to the cloud or some other off-production system, you are making it so much easier for folks to use that data. So I think that's my general perspective on that. Get it to a place where people can play with it. Make it as accessible as possible. Play is the wrong word. I think it's flippant, but I think you understand what I'm getting at. Is make it accessible so folks can get to it. My bits and bytes piece of advice on this is think about record linkage. I have found that particular framework is often the most powerful way to find interesting results that can drive outcomes. So in government, we frequently talk about people falling through the gaps, right? So in education, you and I were chatting about this. Maybe it's a transition from pre-K to primary school, or from middle school to high school, or from high school to the workforce. In the health example, there are lots of these. Somebody has Medicaid, somebody gets off of Medicaid. Somebody is leaving a carceral setting and then become a Medicaid patient. We have so many different legacy systems that capture this information. When we talk about somebody falling through the cracks, it means that the handoff didn't happen. And by pulling all of this data into a self-service environment and then doing record linkage across those data sets, what you're able to do is see a person's journey. It's no longer about Craig in this system or Craig in that system. It's about trying to understand who Craig is across all of these systems. And when you're able to do that, you're really able to understand what's going on. So workforce example is one that's really close to my heart. So many states spend money on workforce training programs. Imagine what you could do if you connect what's happening in your workforce training program with what you are seeing with actual job placement, or folks who are filing their taxes or something like that. By connecting those data sets, you're able to actually quantify your impact and understand what happens. Same thing for those kids who are getting early intervention pre-K. Check what happens with their health outcomes. Opioid data, if you can connect opioid deaths with prescription drug monitoring program information. So you can see, are folks actually getting prescription opioids, or are they getting it in some other way? Fire departments and fire alarm inspections. I mean, the list goes on. But once you've got the data out, you're able to really think about how that links and to get a more nuanced perspective. That tends to be the way I think about that problem.
Yeah, and so what you're talking about is, I hear you talk though, and we've debated this too. What I hear you really talking about is potentially an experience that could be different for citizens, right? And part of that is trust. Citizens, and you and I both know this from our career, citizens build trust in government by just interacting over and over again when services are delivered. So I guess what's in my head as I hear you talk, when you're thinking about or contemplating a data modernization strategy, talk about trust to me, talk about trust in government and the impact on that front.
Another really good question, and also a very tough one. So I'll take my crack at it and would welcome comments from folks who are in the audience, because I'm sure you've had experiences with these too. Data modernization and the approaches that we've described and the way that we framed it is a way to build increased trust with the people we serve, right? Because ultimately the goal here is to enable our workforce to better proactively and in real time address citizen needs. The more we do that, the more likely we are to have high trust. And this is a key issue if we go back to the pandemic again. I think in some ways, trust in government and institutions is very, very low. And at the same time, we have this enormous amount of funding. I think that's what makes this moment so important, is that if we can take that funding and we can convert it somehow to increase levels of trust, that is what lasts for a generation. That's what prepares us for the next crisis. That's what puts us in a better place to respond writ large. That's a lot of highfalutin talk. Very practically, I think what I always recommend is, when you're building your systems, when you're thinking about your data modernization strategy, you're thinking about the particular problem you're trying to solve it with the citizen's perspective in mind. I can't tell you the number of times I've had a conversation and the focus is on a technology or a widget. Somebody has a solution for this problem. And then when you start looking into it, or you have a conversation with a citizen, or you have a conversation with your workforce, a caseworker, a direct service person, they know how things work, and they have really important insights that should fundamentally shape everything we would do. So the way to build the trust in a really practical sense, to have conversations with your citizens. So for our work, we take a human-centered design perspective. It's very in vogue, but that means sitting with people, understanding what their experience is like, what works, what doesn't work. Is a tablet and a phone really the right way to reach the senior citizen who needs to be placed for services? Maybe not. What about the CBOs that work with that citizen? What about the staff on the state or city side that are interacting with that person? What have the true challenges been for them in making that placement? Reflect that in your strategy, reflect that in how you actually implement your technology.
Couldn't agree more. So let me touch on one thing really quick. I know we're getting short here, but I heard you talk about budgeting. Budgeting year over year can be really a challenge. How can something like that impact a modernization strategy on data? I mean, I know I used to pull my hair out with it year over year and really wrung my hands and worried about, how do I keep this thing going? What are your words of wisdom there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it gets to another thing which we should address is, which is how do you start, right? So when we talk about data modernization, the way we're talking about it, it sounds like a $40 million thing that requires multiple agencies and you do it at a state level. I don't think it has to be that big. I think it can start at a department. It can start within a specific program. So think about when you get a grant to do something for diabetes management or street homelessness. The way you design a technology solution or a data solution for that particular program can have a data modernization flair to it, because it can be about more than just the issue you're solving. It can be about connecting to another program that maybe is doing something similar. It can be thinking through the consent implications of sharing this data in a future state, building all of that into your design now. And that is also the answer writ large. So what we recommend frequently is to think about how you braid funding. How can you take private sector funding from a foundation that cares about an issue, with tax levy that you've got available from your legislature, with federal match, and what does that look like over the 3 or 4 year lifespan of a project? You know that we're doing that all the time in government. Just add one more layer to that, which is think about how your system grows. Think about a roadmap that is funding agnostic and be flexible and strategic with that funding. My final bit, because I come from a health and human services perspective, is to think about the Medicaid program. So many of our most vulnerable citizens are vulnerable because they're impacted by various social determinants of health, right? It's very in vogue, but I think folks have known about this for a very long time. Housing, transportation, et cetera. And the Medicaid program is actually very thoughtful about how impacting some of these externalities could also impact health outcomes. So think about how that framework could make federal funds available to support your programming. And in the midst of all of this, I see Lily's question, and I wanted to mention, I want to really address that. So,
Of course, please. Yeah.
privacy and consent, and how you do this in terms of interagency data sharing. This is critical. Like, the last thing you want to do is share sensitive information in a way that hurts someone or impacts the level of trust that somebody might have in these institutions, and that's especially true for folks who are from marginalized populations. In most of our work, we put that up front. We engage in processes. Like, it's a bit of a canned answer, but you need to know the sort of the locality you're working with, work with partners, work with CBOs, be able to get access to folks to design a system in a thoughtful way, and then ideally have a consent process built in. There's no easy answer to this, but what I will say is consent is a process. If you really believe this, consent isn't just somebody ticks a box right now. It's about opportunities to change their mind. It's about opportunities to build your system so that it's actually more equitable from the get-go. So Lily, that's a great question. We could spend like 40 minutes just talking about that, but I appreciate you asking that.
Yeah, I agree totally with you, and I'll throw in a little bit there. We actually revisited those consents on an annual basis. Like, we actually thought it was worthwhile to really revisit those, and they were formal agreements, right? And we went out and took a look at those. So, well, listen, wow, how fast does our time go? But I want to be, I know, terribly fast. We could just put another pot of coffee on and have another hour, I think. But I want to be very respectful of our 30-minute commitment, so we'll wrap it up here. In closing, look, I just want to say that this topic is really so on point. It is exactly where the world is today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. A big thank you to my fellow speaker, Shahir. A special thanks to all of our partners at Resultant and for enabling us to have this. So, last word, my friend, final thoughts.
That is a heavy burden. So let me try and make it quick. So I would leave you with one thought, which is get started wherever you are. If that's with the person across the cube from you, or since we're all virtual, across from the video chat from you. I think data modernization, again, it's a process. It's about a way to get somewhere. It's a vision for how we can serve our citizens. Get started, find really great partners, and hold them to account. I think what you've heard about us as we've talked through this is that we're not out there pitching a widget or a solution. We want to figure out what you need to accomplish and build technology around that. So I've got to give a shout out to one of our regular partners, Google, who's actually helped put together this conversation. We are a technology agnostic firm. We work with lots of folks, but frequently Google is a good partner because they have that same public sector perspective. So please get started. This is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. Work with partners you trust, hold partners to account, and let's accomplish the things we want to accomplish so we can make it life easier for those citizens out there as well as our families. So really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
You got it. Thank you, everybody. We will absolutely look forward to seeing you again soon at another government technology event. Have a great one. See you on the other side. Bye-bye.
Take care.